Hello, everybody. My name is Dusty Whirl. I work at THN as the COC Performance Manager, and today we're going to go over a quick training on motivational interviewing and homeless services. So the purpose of today's training is to provide an introduction to the foundations of motivational interviewing and its application in homeless services, as well as help equip providers with some tools that will enhance their client engagement and improve client outcomes. So that being said, the big question is, what is motivational interviewing, or MI for short? MI is a collaborative, person-centered approach to communication, but it expands beyond that. It was first developed in the 1980s, specifically for addiction treatment. However, since then, it's been expanded to include things such as physical health, mental health, medication management, and homeless services. The core focus of MI is designed to help people resolve ambivalence. Ambivalence is simply put is just the mixed feelings about change. It also helps encourages individuals to identify their own reasons and goals rather than having solutions imposed on them, which is very important because for most of us, we don't like being told what to do with our own lives. We want to be able to make our own decisions on our own time, not because someone else told you to do so. Specifically in homeless services, though, it helps individuals struggling with barriers such as mental health, substance use, trauma, unemployment. This also helps encourage individuals to help take the small steps towards those bigger goals that seem a little bit more intimidating, right? Which the bigger goals could look like housing, recovery, employment, starting to take your medications more consistently, or even getting to see a doctor. It helps make things more manageable for individuals. So why is MI important in homeless services? As mentioned before, there's high ambivalence within the population that we work with. Individuals experiencing homelessness all likely want housing, wants to be sober, wants the stability. I've yet to meet a single individual person who's like, I truly want to be homeless, or I'm okay with the instability. I love that. I've never once heard that in my time, right? Individuals may want these things, may want to change, but because of their ambivalence, they can't, or they don't know how, or are afraid to. They may be overwhelmed by trying to even do it because they're like, oh my God, how do I get housing when I haven't done XYZ yet? Or, man, I want to get sober. This sucks, but I don't know what to do. And it's a big step to go to rehab or even to detox facilities. Those are big decisions, and it scales the hell out of them. It would scare us all as well, right? MI helps provide a non-judgmental space so that we can explore these feelings with them. And by exploring feelings, I'm not talking about like as a therapist, right? Our role is not to provide therapy to individuals, but we can still explore these feelings and help work through there, right? All of us knows there's a lot of distrust in the homeless services system, right? And this can be caused by people's experience of trauma, stigma, or discrimination they've experienced. But also, we know individuals who just distrust the system because somebody somewhere overpromised and then underdelivered. MI here in this situation allows us to help build that rapport, sometimes slowly, across multiple attempts in some cases. But it emphasizes the respect and that the relationship is a partnership, not someone who is, I'm in control because I work at the facility or I work in the program and you don't. This helps reduce that resistance to services, the resistance to change, because now they feel more empowered to make their own decisions. Another reason why this is important is there's homeless services and homelessness has complex needs, right? Many times individuals often juggle multiple different barriers from severe and persistent mental health issues to substance use, unemployment, housing instability, right? This all makes someone who's already struggle even more to wanting to change or make decisions that are good for them. Right? MI here can be more flexible, allows you to address different domains across the person's life one at a time and not all at once. It also keeps the client in the driver's seat. A good thing to think about how what MI does for the provider is you're the passenger who is with the map. You're the expert on the process, but they're the expert of themselves and they can make their own decisions. So as you're providing the information on how to potentially get to point A to point B, they may make decisions that may make it a little longer, but ultimately they still get them there. That's their decision. MI in home service is also well documented to be effective. Studies have shown engagement in programs have increased. Retention in services, that meaning they're more willing and are staying in services longer. There's also been positive outcomes in housing, recovery, and healthcare. So, any of you who may know individuals who do utilize motivational interviewing, you may hear them talk about the spirit of MI, right? And they usually say things like, oh, the spirit of MI is more important than the techniques that MI has. Right? The spirit of MI consists of things like partnership, acceptance, compassion, and evocation. Right? Partnership, this is us working with them, not on them, not for them. We work together with them. We also, with the emphasis on the partnership, is to build that trust through collaboration. An example phrase that you hear sometimes is, let's figure this out together, versus, I need you to figure this out and for you to figure out what decision you want, right? It's let's figure this out together. Let's figure out what we can do to get you to your goals. Next is acceptance, right? This is where the providers, we have to respect the client has autonomy and they can make their own decisions, be it for good or bad. This is where we also can affirm their strengths, right? That strengths perspective. And sometimes this means acknowledging their past efforts on change. What I used to tell people all the time, and I still do, is the process, the process of progress is progress itself. Meaning, as long as you're keeping making attempts, you're moving forward. Another thing about acceptance is avoiding judgments or labels. I've worked in homeless services for a while, and at emergency shelters, it's not uncommon to hear, "Oh, he's back again, and he's still using, or she's still using. They're going to fail again, or it's pointless to keep trying to provide services to this person because they're not ready." Once people start saying that, it lashes onto other people around, and they start to see that, whether it's true or not. Next is compassion. This is where we prioritize the individual's dignity and well-being. We also have to show genuine concern and care. You can't fake it. Anyone who's worked in this field long enough knows that if you fake it, you're going to get called out on it at some point. If you all haven't already. So it's important to respect their dignity and their well-being, right? Examples of what you can hear is, I hear how hard this has been for you. All right, you're empathizing with them, but you're not sympathizing with them. Nobody wants to have sympathy because it doesn't feel good, like most of us sometimes think. But empathizing with them, on the other hand, can be good. It helps reinforces the autonomy as well as just their well-being overall. Last is evocation, right? This is key. This is where we're drawing out the individual's own values, their motivations, their goals, their hopes for their future, right? We are also avoiding imposing our own solutions, right? An example of this would be, what would feel different in your life if housing worked out? Sometimes that's hard for an individual to answer. They don't know. So sometimes you can flip the script and be like, well, what would feel different or be different in your life if housing didn't work out? Because sometimes that's the ambivalence. They're afraid of it not working out. And then usually by having that conversation, you can ask the actual question of, What would feel different in your life if it did work out? Now we got through the spirit of MI. What are the core principles of MI? So the core principles of MI include expressing empathy, developing discrepancies, rolling with resistance, and support self-efficacy. So with expressing empathy, right, we're actively listening and reflecting. We're not playing on our phones. We're not typing on our computers. We're focused on the conversation and actively being a part of it. We show our understanding of their perspective. And this can take many forms, and we'll learn different ways to do this. But an example is it sounds like you had to survive some tough situations. Or, man, I get it. Being pissed off makes so much sense. Something like that to help them know that you start to understand, you're starting to figure out how they're thinking, and you can relate to them. Next is developing the discrepancies, right? This is the most key, one of the top, in my opinion, one of the top two most important principles of MI, right? Because here we're highlighting the gap between their values and their current behaviors. We also can help the clients see why changes matter. Because a lot of times they don't understand, or they don't realize. I don't think they don't understand. I just don't think they realize that sometimes they're not living their values. And that alone can be enough to motivate somebody. Examples here can include things like you've said you value family, but homelessness makes it hard to stay connected. All right, you can go further and be like, you've said that your family has kind of distanced themselves from you since you've become homeless, and even more so since you started using. You've lost contact with them because they don't want to engage with you while you're high. What would it look like if you started to move towards treatment? What would that look like? Right, you can start opening up those conversations then from there. The other important principle is rolling with resistance. This is huge because we all deal with resistance every day when working with people. Right? We avoid arguments and power struggles. They don't exist in this approach. You have no power over them like they have no power over you. Right? It's not that they don't want to change, or they're being difficult. They're struggling, right? This helps rolling with resistance help treat resistance as a signal, right? Because if you're looking at it as a signal and you go, oh, wait, they're resisting this conversation, they're resisting the urge to change. Maybe I need to change my approach, change how I'm talking to them, right? It's a signal for you. It doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you need to change up a little bit, meet their needs, meet them where they're at, not trying to pull them up to your level. Right, examples include, instead of saying things like, yes, you can, try, it sounds overwhelming right now, right? So think about it. If I come in and on something that you're struggling with right now, and I say, paint the Mona Lisa, and you're like, I can't do that. I absolutely cannot do that. I don't have the skill. Yes, you can do that. And I keep hammering it into you. Eventually, you're going to shut down and get upset or angry with me and don't really want to talk to me anymore. Right. So, changing that approach to, hey, it's a difficult task. Let's figure out how we can break that down into smaller goals to help make it a little more manageable, because you could be surprised what you can do. Lastly, one of the last core principles of MI is support of self-efficacy. Right? This is where we reinforce the belief and ability to change. We do this by celebrating the small steps, the small victories, right? Focusing only on those big outcomes does not make people happy. It makes them, the process to get there, while it makes them happy that they're succeeding, you're celebrating it, but they could be discouraged along the way and maybe never reach their big goals because they've given up. As I mentioned before, the process of progress is progress itself. That's celebrating the small steps. Even an attempt to change is worthy of praise. Right, and this can look small. I remember, this example comes from a personal experience that I've had is an individual who struggled to make appointments with me. And one day they showed up on time. And the first words out of my mouth was, "Hey, you made your appointments this time. That's great. What were you doing differently? You're showing persistence. You're doing things differently. What's helping?" Trying to reinforce that change and just celebrate it with them. Excuse me. So now to talk about their core principles and the spirit of MI. Many of you are probably wondering, well, that's great. What are some skills we can start to use today? Well, some of the most basic foundation level skills of motivational interviewing is OARS. It's an acronym. OARS stands for open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. These are all ways you can engage with individuals. And a lot of times you don't move past these skills, because they are infinitely valuable. Even if you're not using motivational learning, these are still helpful skills to know. So what is O? So O is open-ended questions, right? This is where we're avoiding those yes/no questions, right? Those are closed-ended questions, and it doesn't encourage conversation. So examples would be, what are your hopes for the next few months? How do you see housing changing your life? Contrast to, do you think housing would change your life? You could say yes, but then where do you go with that conversation? Now you're following up with another question instead of just naturally having a flow of a conversation, and it's not an interview. Affirmations, right? This is where we're recognizing their efforts, their strengths, and their value, right? You've been strong in surviving this thus far. That can go a long way for someone who's been experiencing homelessness for years or fleeing domestic violence. Right? You keep showing up even when it's difficult. I can't tell you how many times I've said something like this before to people who are at the verge of like, I don't want to do this anymore, I give up, but then they keep showing up. But we're affirming their strengths and their efforts. It's a small step to keep encouraging them to move forward. Reflections, right? This is where we're mirroring things back to the individuals. They can be emotions, it could be a thought. Um, there's different types. Like I mentioned, simple reflection versus complex reflections. Simple reflections are mirroring back just feelings or your understanding of what they're saying. Or complex reflections, you're adding meaning to it. In most cases, I would not recommend doing complex reflections until you go and get trained further in motivational interviewing. But simple reflections are like the example here. You're feeling nervous about shelters, but you also want stability. Or, man, you're pissed off because you got yelled at by a cop today because you're camping on public ground, right? Things like that. That's the know that you're listening actively and you're invested in the conversation and you're invested in them. And finally, there's summaries, right? This is pulling all the idea together and show progress. This can happen at any point of that conversation or that appointment. Normally, it's towards the end, right? So, example of something like this would be: so far, you've said you want housing, you worry about safety, and you're not open to exploring options. And you can just leave it there and just let it hang. And usually that makes them start to think like, oh, wait, yeah, you're right. That is right, but that doesn't make sense, which is what we're looking for. So next thing with motivational interviewing is the difference between change talk and sustained talk. Right? Change talk signals readiness to change. And this could be things like desire. I want to do this. Um, I need to do this even. Ability. I could do this. Or reason, such as, if I got housing, I could see my kids more. Need. I have to get out of this situation, and commitment. I'm going to apply tomorrow. Right? These are things we want to elicit from the conversations. And when you hear that, you want to focus on that. And then there's the sustained talk, right? These are the reasons for staying the same. These are the ones that we typically hear the most initially, right? I can't manage that paperwork with getting my ID or getting to the doctors. I just can't do that. I'm not ready to quit using. Shelters are too dangerous. The shelters, the shelter staff hates me, whatever that might be, right? Those are the sustain talks that are sustaining them to not change. Right? Motivational in my strategies to kind of help with dealing with sustained talk could be you're listening close, you want to listen to the change talk and reflect it and reinforcing that. Because even sometimes there's just a little bit of changes that occur within that sustained talk, and you want to latch onto that and focus on that and not necessarily they're wanting to sustain. When there is sustained talk, though, you don't argue with it. You explore it with curiosity. Explore it as if you're a researcher exploring and researching the most fascinating subject you can think of. Like an example of this, if an individual says, "I can't do this," a response could be like, "It feels too hard right now. What might make it feel easier? Or what would be helpful for you right now?" Right? Things like that, where you're trying to get the conversation to shift a little bit. All right, so I have some examples of motivational interviewing in action, and this is specific to homeless services example. So example one, housing engagement, which we deal with a lot sometimes. A client says, "I don't want to go to shelter. They're unsafe," or some variation of that. A typical response that is not motivational interviewing basis, "You'll be fine. Shelters aren't that bad." You hear that a lot. And that's not always necessarily true. For those who've worked in shelters, know it's difficult to be in a shelter. However, in my response to this would be, you've had bad experiences before, and safety is really important to you. What kind of housing would make you would feel safe, right? Sometimes this allows you to avoid the shelter altogether because they're in a secure place and they've got a tent. They're not going to get in trouble with the law, and they really need to want to focus more on that housing piece and not necessarily just getting into the shelter, but they want the housing. So it looks different for them compared to somebody else. Second example, substance use. Right? We've all heard this time and time again. We'll continue to. I've tried to quit before, but it never works. Or it's difficult, so I don't do it. Or, oh man, it really helps me, focus. Or it helps deal with my problems. I've heard this so many times. It doesn't surprise me anymore. But it's like, oh, you just have to try harder next time. Next time you can do it if you just put a little bit more effort in. That's very discouraging because you're just discrediting everything they're experiencing or have experienced to that point. Where if you did a motivational interviewing response, you could say something like, "It's discouraging when past attempts didn't last. But the fact you've tried shows how much this matters to you. What would help during those times? What could be done different to help you be more successful?" Right? You're trying to focus on getting them to see it's still possible. Third example is around employment. No one will hire me, right? And that could be, "Oh, I have a criminal background," or "I have a good example that I've had is I have schizophrenia and I hear voices and I freak out sometimes, and I don't mean to, and it scares people, so I just quit because I think they're gonna fire me or something, or they just won't hire me." Right? That's normal responses we hear. So most times we hear people sometimes say, "That's not true. There's always jobs out there." And while that is true, there's always a job out there that will hire pretty much anybody. That doesn't do anything for the person because you've now removed emotion out of it. You remove their feelings. You're not even reflecting back to them that it's difficult, that they're struggling. Or an "MI" response could be, "You feel discouraged right now, but you've held jobs before. What strengths helped you succeed then? And then what would help you now?" Right? Things like that can be helpful. Right? Obviously, I've been talking about some things that are why MI is great in homeless services, but I would be remiss to not even mention there are challenges when using MI in homeless services. Right? We're all feeling time pressure. Outreach and shelter, sometimes there's very limited interactions. In some shelters, there's very limited time available for them to stay in shelter to make progress. Right? This is where examples of sometimes using a brief version of MI techniques can be helpful. All right, this looks like one or two reflective questions can make an impact. All right, it's just learning what's the and find out what's that right question. Right, there's trauma histories involved. Right, many clients who are homeless have experienced some form of trauma in one shape or form or another. Right, if we're pushing them to move forward at a faster pace than they're comfortable, we risk them crashing and burning and giving up because they can't handle it. They don't know how to handle it yet. Right, we need to respect their pace. Right, safety and trust must come before change talk. Right, and someone who has trauma history or have been mistrust towards the system, that trust takes a long time. And for an example, I had someone who I housed that was homeless for about 8 or 9 years and would come and go out of shelters. A lot of staff have kind of given up on them. But after 3 or 4 attempts working with me to get them housed, we've got to the point where they were housed. And then we were able to transition them over to rapid rehousing projects or in other caseworkers who can continue maintaining them, right? It takes time and effort on our parts. We also all deal with system demands, right? We all require intakes, documentation, or we have specific goals we must maintain, either due to funding constraints, funding expectations, COC expectations, job performance expectations. We all have that. So it makes it more complicated to try and use this approach sometimes, or it feels that way more than anything else. This is where we need to really balance program requirements with client-centered practices. And usually there's a middle ground here. Use of my language, even while completing forms. We're changing the form a little bit to include motivational language. Tell me in your own words what this means to you to come into this program. It can make a huge impact on things. All right, next is worker drift. Right, it's easy to slip back into giving advice or fixing. Right, fixing is not what people need. People aren't broken. They can do things for themselves. They need help and guidance. It's to guide the person, not direct them. Remember, you're the expert on the process. They're the expert of themselves. And you're guiding them like a tour guide does in an unfamiliar environment for most people. Right? It's good to practice reflective listening in every conversation until it becomes a habit. And so you're less likely to drift into the I need to just give this person advice, or I need to fix this person, or this person needs fixed. Right? So what does MI look like kind of in daily practice? So I have some tips for you all. Right? I recommend starting small with individuals. Focus on the achievable goals, right? And building upon those successes. This could look like getting an ID, keeping one appointment, or filling out part of an application. Things that are like, it's expected of them to do, but it could mean the world to them that they've done that because that's as far as they've gotten before or never gotten that far. So you're now praising that effort and reinforcing it. You can use motivational imagery in brief context. I remember working in shelters as case manager and a shelter manager. Sometimes I'm seeing people in passing because they go out and do their own thing. Or I see them at mealtime and I am just having a casual conversation with them, like, hey, how are things? I hear you're working on getting a job. How's that going? And, reflecting back what I hear and then offering the assistance if I can't help them in that moment because I'm either serving the dinner or in the middle of something else, but I'm still trying to provide that reflective listening and the affirmation. Right. Another thing is to make reflections a habit. Excuse me. Aim for at least 50% of your responses to be reflections, not questions. All right. You're going to get information by simply reflecting things back at them where questions aren't needed. And if you think about it, how many of us really want to be asked a question every day, all the time when I'm talking to somebody? That's not fun. It shuts people down, right? An example, instead of saying things like, why don't you want shelter to? You're worried about shelter being safe. And then you can leave it there. I mean, you can also choose to follow up with what would help you feel more safe in a shelter, or are there other things you can think of that would be better for you? And it's still a question, but you've done a reflective question at that. Reinforce the small wins, which is a huge thing. I'm pretty sure I've talked about it multiple times in different examples. Reinforcing the small wins, right? You're celebrating their progress, showing up to appointments, making even a single phone call can be a big milestone for somebody who's struggling or having a little bit of resistance. Even then, exploring apartments.com could be a big thing that they've never done before, and we need to make a big deal about it because it's a great sign. This helps build confidence step by step because they start to go, okay, I can do this. Yeah, someone else was recognizing that I'm capable of this. I can start believing in myself. And next is just keeping in mind the spirit of MI, right? Partnership, acceptance, the compassion, the evocations. That is the most important thing to do is to live these things. Even when under pressure and under stress, keeping the spirit of MI in mind can go so far with progress with people. So today's training is coming to an end. So this is not an all-inclusive training, as you know. There's huge amounts to learn about motivational interviewing more in depth, such as the trans-theoretical model of change, which is important to know, further techniques and understanding. So here I have some resources to help for you all to help learn more and explore more. There's different books and guides as well as the training and networks. Mint is a good place to go look. Motivational interviewing is offered routinely online. I will say it is not a free training, but it could be worth time to make a request to your supervisor about going to a training. Sometimes there are free online resources that are similar to this, or maybe go a little bit more in depth with techniques. Other places look. Sometimes universities do host open free courses on counseling and motivational interviewing. While I would recommend if you're in homeless services, not necessarily attending the counseling ones, but if there's anything on motivational interviewing or motivational strategies, you should explore those. Right. And then finally, with just kind of continuing learning this, is practice with colleagues and supervisors through role play scenarios. You can reflect client interactions to yourself when you're just thinking about how you performed for the day. Did I use orbs? Did I hear change talk? Until you get used to it and comfortable with it. Ultimately, there are some key takeaways from today. So first off, the key takeaways of what is MI, right? It's a collaborative, respectful, and evidence-based approach that focuses on resolving ambivalence and building motivation for change. The key components of motivational interviewing include the spirit of MI, partnership, acceptance, compassion, and evocation. And you have your principles, right? Developing discrepancies, supporting self-efficacies, expressing empathy, and rolling with their resistance. A skill that was learned today was ORS, using open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. And starting to have an understanding of the difference between a change talk and sustained talk. Strengthen one, explore the other. You strengthen the change talk, but you explore the sustained talk. And we ultimately also found why it matters in homeless services, right? It helps build trust with clients who already distrust the system. It helps clients engage more fully in services, as well as encourage small, realistic steps to their longer term goals. And this quote I liked a lot, and encourage you all to kind of exploring more, but motivational interviewing is about arranging conversations so that people talk themselves into change based on their own values and interests. Not about what other wants or do's, but their own values and their own interests. These are the references used for today's slides. Lastly, thank you all for watching this video. If you have more questions about motivational interviewing, you can always reach out to me or the planning team at texasboscoc@thm.org, and we can maybe provide a little bit more in-depth training for case managers or point you in the right direction for more formal trainings. Again, thank you. Have a great day.